This early morning, let's explore the tantalizing prospect of living with no expectations. And then let's meditate. This is Lama Jigme Gyatso of the Buddha Joy Meditation School. Welcome to Meditate Like a Jedi, which is brought to you by the kind-hearted folks who help support this channel on Patreon. This morning, we could chant and meditate and enjoy a lesson or two, but first, if you love Star Wars and you wish to meditate as transformatively as young Luke Skywalker on Dagobah under the guidance of Yoda, be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Good news. If at any point you have a specific question about Buddhist meditation or Buddhist philosophy or how to apply them to your life, simply type your question in great detail in the chat window on the right-hand side of the screen. Oh, pardon me. Before we go any further, I need to blow my nose. Dave Robinson wrote a book known as The Expectation Effect. This is not a new concept. I used to go to, before I met my tantric partner, I used to attend a monthly meetup for quote-unquote spiritually minded vegans in my little corner of Southern California. And boy, that was a great place to go and hear a lot of cliches. One of the most popular cliches is, I have no expectations. Now that's more of an aphorism than an accuracy. Well, what's an aphorism? An aphorism, or an affirmation, is a really pretty sounding lie that we tell ourselves in the hopes that it will create a form of practical magic. The problem is we evolved mechanisms that are reality-based to keep us alive, and we know when we're lying to ourselves. And even if we could successfully lie to ourselves, can we lie to reality? And the answer is no. The greatest luminaries, whether we're talking about the sage or the Buddha or the Christ, did not talk about bending reality to our will through the tool of belief. It talked about humbly accepting the present moment. Huge difference. Arrogantly controlling the present moment or humbly accepting the present moment. So let's explore this a bit further. Let's assume, I'm going to assume that if you're watching my face and hearing my voice, you value science. Science is not a body of knowledge, but a set of techniques to help us to acquire knowledge and free from the influence of logical fallacies and cognitive biases, which make fools and children of us all. A good scientist knows that due to flaws or eccentricities of biology, we're each of us susceptible to fallacy and cognitive bias. And they work very hard to undermine those tendencies, including undermining their own defensiveness and asking others to disprove their scientific findings, keeping no secrets. And the idea is that if people with the best of intentions cannot replicate your findings, then your findings are in error. So science is really a good-hearted attempt to see clearly. And up to this point, science has shown that the further we go back in history, in time, before there were humans, before there were primates, before there were mammals, each of us had primary survival mechanisms. Entities without survival mechanisms did not live long enough to pass on that genetic trait. In other words, as was put very well by a science educator on TikTok, dead beings don't fuck. So natural selection is all about well, you've got a set of traits. Do they help you live long enough to reproduce? If not, then those traits do not get passed on. That's just how it works. So we can look at the traits shared by the majority of mammals this way. In terms of 8. In terms of absolutely hating peril, pain, scorn, and anonymity. Now you might say, dude, I'm shy, I'm an introvert, I like anonymity. You might, but your genes don't, because if you go back 100 years or 300 years or 500 years or 1,000 years or 5,000 years or 50,000 years, our survival as mammals was largely dependent upon the mechanics of our pack or tribe or herd. And if we had a position of prominence in our tribe or herd or pack, we had more safety and more food and meeting opportunities. If our position of within the pack or herd or tribe was one of contempt or scorn, we had less safety, less eating, and less mating opportunities. So in a very real, pragmatic sense, we are wired to hunger for prestige, as well as hunger for a modicum of plenty, pleasure, praise, and fame, as well as influence. We are wired for that. If we can ignore our wiring all we want. We can tell ourselves pretty lies. We can try to coerce ourselves with lines of reasoning that will not change our neurons. In fact, I'd like to take a moment to look at an artist's rendering of the human brain. It's always a dangerous thing when a highly specialized industry has techniques invented by outsiders. For instance, medical insurance companies are not altruistic institutions. They are profit-driven institutions. And when they saw how long their members were going to therapy, they concluded that that's not financially advantageous. And so they came up with the idea of short-term therapy. They resurrected the idea of the rational emotive approach. They rebranded it as cognitive CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, but it does a lot of the same things. It relies heavily on using our prefrontal cortex to argue with our underbrain. Now, our prefrontal cortex is Jim Dandy, but it did not evolve to police the underbrain. We can liken our prefrontal cortex to a very expensive goblet, perhaps one made of Waterford crystal. Yes, you could use Waterford crystal to pound a nail once. It won't do a very good job, and it'll damage the Waterford crystal. Similarly, many people who come to therapy reporting generalized anxiety disorder after 6 months or 12 months or 18 months still have generalized anxiety disorder, but they also have developed the symptom set of depression because they have exhausted their prefrontal cortex, using it to do that which it has not evolved to do. Consequently, we can conclude that it's not our job to fight our neurology. Let's take this a step further. Let's adjust my climate. So I'm going to return to button 5. And let's re-examine our worldview. There are 2 primary worldviews according to the 81 poems of the Tao Te Ching. The first one is Yang, or patriarchy, and it's about being rigid, fearful, controlling, elitist, cryptic, competitive, and cruel. And this is embraced by the majority of humans in any endeavor. Professional, personal, recreational, secular, spiritual, whatever the endeavor, a lot of people exhibit these traits. A minority of humans embrace the path of being flexible, loving, laid-back, egalitarian, lucid, cooperative, and kind. So let's narrow this down. We can be laid back, or we can be controlling. Now let's return to the lesson at hand. The path of Lao Tzu, the path of Gautama, the path of Yeshua HaMoshiach is about the path of radical acceptance. Now, can their teachings be manipulated for purposes that their authors did not intend? Yes, that happens all the time. In fact, a song was written about that by Ray Charles called "Look What They Done to My Song." But if we wish to be happy, if we wish to be healthy, we will live in harmony with the biology of our central nervous system and not in opposition to it. So when people say that they have no expectations, that's not entirely accurate. Their expectations are either that their desires will be fulfilled or thwarted, that their dreads will be fulfilled or avoided. It's a very simple thing. When we are feeling positive, we are expecting that we will be lavished with plenty, pleasure, praise, and fame, and freed from scarcity, pain, scorn, and anonymity. When we are feeling negative or frightened or angry, we are convinced that we will be denied the plenty, pleasure, praise, and fame we need in order to survive and pass on our genetic material, and that instead we will be inundated with scarcity, pain, scorn, and anonymity. So this is locked into our central nervous system. Now we have to be careful. There's two main camps in psychology. Those who treat it as a philosophy and those who treat it as a science. People who treat it as a philosophy can come up with all sorts of things. Doesn't mean it's grounded in reality. Doesn't mean it's going to help. Science is predicated upon acting from a hypothesis, testing the hypothesis, drawing conclusions based on the tests, and then submitting those tests to peer review at the very least. And of course, the methodology has to be logical and has to be extremely replicatable, so it has to be very, very precise. But that's the basic thumbnail sketch, the scientific method. And there's a huge difference between philosophy and science in this day and age. Even though etymologically they used to come from the same discipline, that's beside the point. Now let's turn to Buddhism. In the Anapanasati Sutta, the Buddha explained the 7 enlightenment factors. The first one is mindfulness. The inference is just as if 3 plus 4 equals 7, if you take away 3 and you're only left with 4, you don't have 7. It's a mathematical certitude. Similarly, if we undermine our mindfulness, even with the best of intentions, spiritually speaking, we are sabotaging our journey on the path of liberation. So, here's a ridiculous way of illustrating the way sometimes people use quasi-spiritual sounding intentions or affirmations. La 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 la, I have no expectations, I have no fears, I have no desires, I'm completely content, I am. Pathetic, is it not? So, that is not the antidote to neurosis. That's fertilizer for neurosis. I was never a fan of the Seinfeld TV show. I preferred his stand-up to his sitcom. That's just me. I'm not going to say it's bad. Just not my cup of tea. But there was an episode that I overheard my former wife watching when I was in the other room. And the most frequently used exclamation of the episode was, "Serenity now!" And a character in that episode said, yeah, it was my enthusiastic use of that which hastened my mental illness. And of course that was revealed at the very end of the show after George Costanza had been screaming that for the majority of the show. Now, that show is a work of fiction, and it doesn't claim to be anything other than that. So I'm not here to throw shade on that episode of the Seinfeld show. But quite often when we run from reality, we do much more harm to ourselves than good. If we're going to use the goals of the Buddha, we might think about using his techniques. The goals of the Buddha were to liberate us, not from the presence of our drives, but from their tyranny, to make us far less neurotic and much more peaceful and consequently loving. So we have to be honest with ourselves. We have to practice vulnerability. And the price, let me rephrase that. We have to practice mindfulness. And the price of mindfulness is the discomfort of vulnerability. To admit to ourselves that, yes, right now I'm feeling thus and such. So we can't lie to ourselves successfully and say, I'm not feeling thus and such. It's kind of like saying, I'm not thinking of the color red. I'm not thinking of a red apple. I'm not thinking of a clown's red nose, or the red nose they used in Patch Adams. I'm not thinking about a red fire engine. I'm not thinking about a red pomegranate. I'm not thinking about the garish red found in a child's paint set. I'm not thinking about the red of royalty or the red of a velvet liner in a guitar case. I'm not thinking about red at all. But guess what? You are, aren't you? So self-talk is horribly ineffective and very expensive when it comes to our physical and emotional well-being. Enter meditation. Meditation is not about fighting our neurology, but about dancing with it. Every time we breathe in, and I'm going to jump forward for this. Every time we breathe in, especially if during that inhalation we silently and mentally recite the demonstrative pronoun this. Every time we breathe in, we involuntarily access our sympathetic nervous system, which has not evolved to actively concentrate, but has evolved to merely notice, and to do so vulnerably, passively, viscerally, and randomly. We've evolved to notice sights, sounds, sensations, flavors, scents, and the like. We've evolved to notice our emotions, intentions, thoughts, memories, and imaginings. We've evolved to notice the external, the internal, the physical, the mental, the pleasurable, the painful, the interesting, the boring, the glorious, and the grotesque. Then how do we cope with that which we notice? Successfully coping with what we're experiencing is as close as our next exhalation. Especially if during that exhalation we silently and mentally recite the word yes. For each exhalation is wired by evolutionary biology to effortlessly access our parasympathetic nervous system, which has evolved for both physical relaxation as well as at least a modicum of mental release. We could think of these two aspects of our autonomic nervous system as potentially functioning as a built-in therapist. And it gives us the safety to be honest with ourselves. So, for instance, we could say, when I go to this party, I want to meet a prospect who's going to make me lots of money and lead me to other prospects, so I don't have to, so I have plenty of money to buy rent and food and shelter and clothing and medical care, which are completely legitimate needs. So we could say, I'm going to this party and I have these desires. I want these desires to be fulfilled. And you could say, so as you breathe in, you can label that whole mess this. And as you exhale, instead of resisting it, you can just be honest with yourself, say, yes, I am experiencing that. But as you breathe in, you might say, but I'm scared I won't get those things, therefore I have a negative expectation. Yes, I do. And that negative expectation is painful. Yes, it is. And I hate that negative expectation. Yes, I do. And the great thing is, by completely agreeing with yourself, we are backing away from our habit of living in resistance. And we can explore all four permutations of this. I have a positive expectation of this happening, a negative expectation of this happening. I'm living in resistance to my negative expectation. I'm living in hunger and greed for my positive expectation. All these things fuel the fires of our neurosis. It's far more honest to say to ourselves that in this moment I'm experiencing these desires and these dreads. Yes, I am. This is how I feel about these desires and these dreads. Yes, this is how I feel. I'm concerned that I have little or no control. Yes, I am concerned. Through this practice of noticing and then agreeing, whether these observations are external or internal, helps us to be less and less and less and less controlled by our primal drives. This is the path of fulfillment. There are lots of people who are whose entire life is about acquisition, and they may be very clever but not very wise. They might have lots of pleasures but no real fulfillment. These are the people who will, at a dinner party, say, I have more money in my billfold than you, therefore I'm important and you're a piece of garbage. And they might sincerely believe that. These are the poster children of those who are controlled by their primary drives. The people who are happy, healthy, and well-adjusted still have the same drives, but they've been liberated from the tyranny of those drives. And that is the antidote offered by the Buddha. Checking the time, I sure did do a lot of gabbing today. Okay, I'm going to tap button 9, and we can prepare for the latest iteration of this morning's practice text, Easy Meditations Proto-Zen. So what I'd like us to do is to train the neural pathways, exercise the neural pathways responsible for empathy and enthusiasm simply by performing the recitations of bodhicitta and refuge. And because I am an aging fitness freak, I'm going to blend this with the performance of geriatric step back squat thrusts. If you wish to join me, you are entirely welcome. but I assure you it's not mandatory. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. That's delightfully invigorating, is it not? The set of mindfulness and meditation is known by many names, such as Zen, Chan, Dhyana, Mahamudra, Ati Yoga, Dzogchen, and Trekshö, or slice through. Let us practice following the instructions that I shared with you during the opening lesson. But first, and this is an error on my part. Let's take a moment to chant a selection from Yong Jia Zhuan Jui's Song of Enlightenment. I have continued my zazen for many aeons. I do not say this to confuse you. I raise the Dharma banner and set forth all teaching. It is the clear doctrine of the Buddha which I found with my teacher Huineng. Mahakashyapa became the Buddha's successor, received the lamp and passed it on. 28 generations of teachers in India, then overseas and rivers to all land. Bodhidharma came as our own first founder, and his robe as we all know passed through 6 teachers here. And how many generations do come making the path no one knows. The truth is not set forth, the false is basically vacant. Put both existence and non-existence aside, and then even non-vacancy is vacant. The 20 kinds of vacancy have no basis, and the oneness of the Tathagata being is naturally sameness. Mind is the base phenomena or dust, yet both are like a flaw in the mirror. When the flaw is brushed aside, the light begins to shine. Then both mind and phenomena are forgotten when we become naturally genuine. This is so important. Our goal is not to pretend to be something we're not. Our goal is not to pretend to feel something we're not. Our goal is to flow from a place of loving, centered spontaneity. All the degenerate materialistic world, people are unhappy, they find self-control difficult. In the centuries since Shakyamuni falls views all deep. Demons are strong, the Dharma is weak, disturbances are many. Okay, thank you for humoring me. Let's meditate. The quest is not to squander our lives like a doormat, but for our choices, utterances, and deeds to flow from a place of the highest love, which is spontaneous and uncontrived. A centered spontaneity, not a scattered one. Having sat for the better part of an hour, it could be terribly refreshing. Oops, one moment. Having sat for the better part of an hour, it may be refreshing to knock out a few geriatric step-back squat thrusts. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. May I liberate all beings from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging by relying on the Buddha's example, instructions, and students. Let us seal our practice with the wishing love described in the four immeasurables. May everyone be free from misery. May everyone be happy. May no one be separated from the happiness. May everyone have balance from the tyranny of hating, craving, and clinging, freed. If you feel that I have earned it, you could type something in the chat window. You could give this live stream a thumbs up. You could share it with a friend. You could even help support this channel on Patreon. In approximately 2¼ hours, I would very much like to return to lead today's mid-morning meditation. Until then, may you and yours be happy and healthy. And if you are as geeky as me, this is the way.